What happens when a Hollywood legend, forged in the fires of gritty westerns and unflinching war epics, faces a smarmy talk show host who thinks he can rewrite history with a smirk? Clint Eastwood, the man whose steely gaze could silence a saloon, walked onto Jimmy Kimmel's stage, expecting a conversation about his latest film. Instead, he got a trap. Kimmel, with his polished suit and sharper tongue, had no interest in Eastwood's new war drama. No, he wanted to dig up the past, to drag Clint through the mud of old controversies, to poke at scars from decades ago. The audience, packed with fans and skeptics alike, sensed the tension before a single word was spoken. Clint's boots hit the stage floor, each step heavy, deliberate, like a gunslinger entering a duel. Kimmel leaned back in his chair, grinning, ready to fire the first shot. This wasn't going to be a friendly chat. This was war. Clint settled into the guest chair, his weathered hands resting on his knees. Kimmel didn't waste time. He launched into a jab about Clint's early westerns, calling them outdated, relics of a time when men were men, and nobody cared about feelings. The crowd chuckled, but Clint's jaw tightened. He wasn't here to be mocked. He'd spent years crafting stories of sacrifice, honor, and the cost of violence, not just playing cowboys. Kimmel, though, smelled blood. He pressed harder, bringing up a 1970s interview where Clint had made blunt comments about war and politics. Words that, back then, were just honest, but now, in Kimmel's hands, were twisted into something ugly, divisive. The host held up a grainy photo from that era, Clint in a leather jacket looking defiant. Kimmel waved it like a prosecutor with evidence. "So, Clint, you still think that way? You still that guy?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Clint leaned forward, his eyes narrowing to slits. "You digging up old dirt, Jimmy? That the best you got?" His voice was low, gravelly, a warning shot. The audience shifted, sensing the air thicken. Kimmel didn't back down. He doubled down, accusing Clint of glorifying violence in his films, of being out of touch with today's world. He tossed out buzzwords, like he was reading from a script meant to rile up the crowd. Clint's fingers gripped the armrests. He'd faced critics before, but this wasn't criticism. This was a setup, a public shaming disguised as entertainment. Kimmel kept pushing, his smile never fading, as if he enjoyed watching Clint squirm. "Come on, Clint, defend yourself. Or is the tough guy act just for the cameras?" Kimmel taunted, leaning closer, his eyes gleaming with malice. The crowd gasped, some cheering, others murmuring in shock. Clint's face was stone, but his silence was louder than words. He didn't need to shout to command the room. He stood, slowly, his 6-foot frame towering over the set. "You want to talk tough, kid? I've lived tougher days than you'll ever know," he growled, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Kimmel laughed, but it was nervous, forced. He hadn't expected Clint to stand, to meet his challenge head-on. The audience was on edge, hanging on every word, every movement. Clint took a step toward Kimmel's desk, pointing a finger like it was a loaded gun. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've seen, what I've fought for. You sit there flapping your gums, thinking you're clever. You're not. You're a coward with a microphone." Kimmel's grin faltered, but he scrambled to regain control. "Whoa, Clint, relax, it's just a show," he said, raising his hands, playing the victim now. The audience wasn't buying it. They could see the truth. Kimmel had picked a fight with the wrong man. Clint didn't sit back. Down. He stayed standing, his presence filling the stage, a living legend refusing to be torn down by cheap shots. The tension was electric, the kind that makes your heart pound, your palms sweat. This wasn't just a talk show spat. This was Clint Eastwood, unyielding, facing off against a host who thought he could break him. And it was only the beginning. The stage vibrated with the weight of Clint Eastwood's words, his finger still pointed at Jimmy Kimmel, who sat frozen behind his desk, his fake chuckle fading into a thin, uneasy smile. The audience held its breath, caught between awe and dread, as Clint's shadow seemed to swallow the room. Kimmel, scrambling to save face, leaned forward, his voice sharp but shaky. "Coward? Me? Come on, Clint, I'm just asking questions. The people want answered," he snapped, jabbing a finger toward the crowd, as if they were his allies. But the room wasn't with him. Murmurs rippled through the seats, some clapping for Clint, others whispering about Kimmel's nerve. Clint didn't flinch. His eyes burned with a fire that had stared down outlaws and generals on screen, and now it was locked on a man who thought words were enough to bring him down. "You think you're clever, twisting my life into your little game," Clint said, his voice slow, deliberate, each word a hammer strike. He stepped closer to the desk, his boots thudding against the stage, forcing Kimmel to lean back. "I've fought in wars on film, told stories of men who bled for something real. What have you done, Jimmy? Mocked people for laughs? You're not asking questions. You're hunting for blood." The crowd erupted, some cheering, others gasping, the air thick with the raw edge of truth. Kimmel's face twitched, his mask of confidence cracking. He wasn't used to being called out, not like this. Not by a man whose presence made his slick jokes feel small, cheap. Kimmel shot up from his chair, trying to match Clint's height, but he looked like a kid playing tough. "Hunting? Oh, please. Clint, spare us the drama. You're the one who's been dodging accountability forever," he shouted, his voice shrill, betraying his panic. He grabbed a stack of note cards, waving them like a weapon. "I've got quotes, interviews, your own words. You want to talk real? Let's talk about the things you said, the things you stand for." He flung a card toward Clint, but it fluttered uselessly to the floor. The gesture was desperate, and the audience saw it. Clint didn't even glance at the card. His stare stayed fixed on Kimmel, unyielding, like a predator sizing up prey. "You want to drag up my past? Fine. But you don't get to rewrite it," Clint growled, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous. He leaned over the desk now, hands planted on its edge, close enough that Kimmel flinched. "I said what I said back. Then because I saw things, lived things, you'll never understand. You think you can judge me with your little cards? You're a vulture, picking at scraps, pretending it's courage." The crowd roared, a mix of cheers and shouts, some standing now, feeding off Clint's defiance. Kimmel's eyes darted to the audience, then back to Clint, realizing he was losing the room. He tried to laugh it off, but it came out as a nervous bark. "Vulture? That's rich, coming from a guy who's been coasting on his tough guy shtick for decades," he spat. But the words sounded hollow, desperate. Clint straightened, his hands leaving the desk, but his presence didn't shrink. He turned slightly, addressing the audience now, his voice steady, commanding. "This man thinks he can tear me down to make himself big, but I've faced worse than him. I've faced real fights, real loss. He's got nothing but a loud mouth and a cheap suit." The crowd exploded, clapping, stomping, some yelling Clint's name. Kimmel's face reddened, his hands balling into fists. He wasn't just losing the argument, he was losing control. He stepped around the desk, closing the gap between them, his voice a harsh whisper meant for Clint alone. But the mics caught it. "You're done, old man. You walk out now, or I bury you on this stage." Clint's lips curled into a faint, dangerous smile, the kind that promised trouble. He didn't step back. He didn't need to. Clint Eastwood's faint smile lingered, a razor's edge of defiance that cut through Jimmy Kimmel's whispered threat. The audience, still buzzing from the clash, leaned forward, their cheers and murmurs a restless hum. Kimmel, his face flushed, with anger stepped closer, his breath quick, eyes wild with the need to reclaim control. "You think you can intimidate me, Clint? You're nothing but a washed-up relic," he hissed, loud enough for the mics to catch, his voice cracking under the strain. Clint didn't move, his boots rooted to the stage, his silence a weapon. sharper than Kimmel's words. The host's bravado was unraveling, his hands trembling as he pointed at Clint, desperate to turn the tide. But Clint's calm, unyielding stare told a different story. This was a man who'd faced down worse than a loudmouth with a grudge. "You're out of your depth, Jimmy," Clint said, his voice steady like a judge passing sentence. He turned, his head slightly, addressing the crowd without breaking eye contact with Kimmel. "This guy thinks he can shame me, make me crawl, because he's got a stage and a spotlight. But I've walked through fire. I've told stories that matter, about men who fought, who died, who stood for something. What's he got? A cheap shot and a laugh track." The audience erupted, clapping and shouting, some rising to their feet, their voices a wave of support. Kimmel's eyes darted to the crowd, his confidence crumbling as he saw their allegiance shift. He wasn't the hero here, he was the bully, and the room knew it. Kimmel, cornered, lashed out. "Stories? You call those blood-soaked movies stories? You're a hypocrite, Clint, preaching honor while you glorify pain," he shouted, slamming his fist on the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. He grabbed another note card, this one with a quote from one of Clint's war films, and read it mockingly, twisting the words to paint Clint as a warmonger. The crowd booed, their disapproval a low rumble, but Kimmel pressed on, his voice rising to a frantic pitch. "You want to play the victim? Fine, but the world's moved on, and you're stuck in the past, old man." He threw the card at Clint's feet, a childish act that only deepened the audience's scorn. Clint glanced down, then back up, his expression cold, unamused. "You're embarrassing yourself," Clint said, his voice low, cutting through Kimmel's rant like a blade. He stepped forward, closing the gap between them, his presence towering, undeniable. "You don't get to lecture me about pain. I've seen it, felt it, carried it. You've got nothing but a script and a paycheck." The crowd roared, their cheers shaking the room, some chanting Clint's name. Kimmel's face twisted, his anger boiling over into something reckless. He shoved a finger into Clint's chest, a bold, foolish move. "You don't scare me," he yelled, but his voice wavered, betraying his fear. The audience gasped, the tension spiking, every eye locked on the two men, inches apart, the air between them crackling with the promise of chaos. Clint didn't flinch at the shove, but his eyes darkened, a storm brewing behind them. He grabbed Kimmel's wrist, not hard but firm, holding it like a warning. "Don't touch me, kid," he growled, his voice a low rumble that silenced the room. He released Kimmel's wrist, letting it drop, and stepped back, giving the host one last chance to back off. Kimmel, humiliated, rubbed his wrist, his face a mask of rage and shame. He opened his mouth to fire back, but the words caught in his throat. The crowd was on Clint's side, their cheers a deafening tide, and Kimmel knew it. He'd pushed too far, and now he was drowning in the consequences. Clint turned to the audience, his back to Kimmel, a deliberate dismissal. "This ain't worth my time," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality, as if Kimmel no longer existed. The audience's roar filled the room, a tidal wave of cheers and stomps that drowned out the last echo of Clint Eastwood's words. His back to Jimmy Kimmel, he stood like a monument, unmovable, his dismissal of the host a slap sharper than any fist. Kimmel, his face a blotchy red, clutched the edge of his desk, his knuckles white, his humiliation laid bare. The crowd's support for Clint was a living thing, pulsing, growing, and it stung Kimmel deeper than any insult. He wasn't done, though. His pride, battered but stubborn, drove him to one last, reckless lunge for control. "You think you can just turn your back on me?" he shouted, his voice shrill, cracking like glass. He stepped forward, circling to face Clint, his eyes burning with a mix of rage and desperation. "You don't get to walk away like some cowboy hero. This is my stage." Clint stopped, his shoulders tensing, but he didn't turn. His silence was a wall, and Kimmel's words bounced off it. Weak, frantic. The audience quieted, sensing the shift, their eyes darting between the two men. Kimmel, emboldened by the pause, pushed harder, his voice rising to a taunt. "What's wrong, Clint? No more tough guy lines? You're just gonna slink off, tail between your legs?" He laughed, a harsh, forced sound, and pointed at Clint's back, playing to the crowd he'd already lost. But the room didn't laugh. With him. They booed, low and steady, a chorus of disgust that made Kimmel's smirk falter. Clint's head tilted slightly, just enough to show he was listening, and the air grew heavy, charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Slowly, Clint turned, his boots scraping the stage, each step deliberate, measured. His eyes locked on Kimmel, not with anger, but with something colder, deeper. A disdain that made the host take a half-step back. "Your stage?" Clint said, his voice quiet but piercing, carrying the weight of a lifetime's battles. "This ain't your stage, Jimmy. It's just a platform for your ego. You built nothing. You earned nothing. You just tear down men better than you." The crowd exploded, their cheers a thunderclap, some standing, clapping, shouting Clint's name. Kimmel's face twisted, his mouth opening and closing, searching for a comeback, but Clint wasn't done. He took a step closer, his presence swallowing the space between them. "You wanted a fight. You got one. But you're out of ammo, kid." Kimmel, cornered, snapped. "Out of ammo? I'm just getting started," he yelled, his voice hoarse, frantic. He grabbed a photo from his desk, a still from one of Clint's old films, and held it up, shaking it like evidence. "This is you, Clint. This is all you are. Violence, bravado, a fake hero for a world that doesn't exist anymore." He tore the photo in half, the rip loud in the stunned silence, and flung the pieces at Clint's feet. The crowd gasped, then booed louder, their anger a living force. Clint looked at the torn photo, then back at Kimmel, his expression unreadable but his eyes blazing. "You think that hurts me?" he said, his voice low, dangerous. "You can't tear down what's real. My work. My life. It's bigger than your petty games." He kicked the photo scraps aside, a small, deliberate act that felt like a gunshot. Kimmel's hands shook, his control gone, his stage no longer his. He lunged forward, pointing, shouting over the crowd's jeers. "You're a fraud, Clint. A has-been who can't face the truth." But his words were lost in the noise, the audience's support for Clint a tidal wave that swept him away. Clint shook his head, a faint, bitter smile on his lips. He'd had enough. He turned again, this time toward the stage's exit, his strides long, purposeful. "Keep talking, Jimmy," he called over his shoulder, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You're only burying yourself." The crowd roared, their cheers a battle cry as Clint walked off, his silhouette strong, unbroken, a legend refusing to bow. Clint Eastwood's silhouette vanished into the wings, his final words, "Keep talking, Jimmy. You're only burying yourself," hanging in the air like smoke after a gunshot. The audience's cheers thundered, a relentless wave of support that shook the room, their voices chanting Clint's name, some standing, clapping until their hands stung. Jimmy Kimmel stood alone on the stage, his face drained of color, his hands limp at his sides. The torn photo scraps at his feet were a symbol of his failure, a desperate act that had backfired, exposing his pettiness to a crowd that now despised him. He opened his mouth, trying to salvage the moment, but the mics caught only a weak stammer. "Folks, come on, it's just a show," he said, his voice thin, pleading, but the crowd's boos drowned him out, a chorus of rejection that echoed in his ears. Kimmel's stage, his kingdom, had crumbled, and he was no longer its king. Backstage, Clint moved through the narrow hallway, his boots echoing on the concrete floor, his face set, unyielding. A young stagehand, wide-eyed, stepped aside, muttering, "You're a legend, Mr. Eastwood." Clint nodded, a brief, gruff acknowledgement, but his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't thinking about Kimmel's cheap shots or the crowd's cheers. He was thinking about the battles he'd fought, on screen and off, the stories he'd told of men who stood tall against impossible odds. Kimmel's attack wasn't new. It was just louder, uglier, a coward's way of challenging a giant. Clint's legacy, built on decades of sweat, sacrifice, and truth, was ironclad, untouchable by a man who thrived on tearing others down. He paused at the exit door, his hand on the handle, and took a slow breath, the weight of the night settling in his bones. On stage, Kimmel tried to pivot, forcing a laugh, grabbing his note cards as if he could restart the show. "All right, let's move on. We've got more guests," he shouted. But the audience wasn't listening. Some were still clapping for Clint, others talking among themselves, their voices a hum of excitement, recounting the clash they'd just witnessed. A woman in the front row stood, pointing at Kimmel. "You went too far," she yelled, her voice sharp, cutting through the noise. Others joined in, their accusations a growing storm. "Shame on you! Clint's a hero!" Kimmel's smile froze, his eyes darting to the control booth, silently begging for a commercial break. But the cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of his defeat. His empire of smugness reduced to rubble in minutes. Clint pushed open the exit door, stepping into the cool night air, the distant sound of the crowd's cheers fading behind him. He didn't need their applause to know who he was. He'd faced down Kimmel's venom with the same grit he'd brought to every role, every fight, every moment that defined him. The host's words, his taunts, his torn photo, they were nothing. Dust in the wind compared to the stories Clint had told, the lives he'd touched through his work. He climbed into his car, the engine's rumble a low, familiar comfort, and glanced back at the studio one last time. Kimmel was still in there, floundering, trying to claw his way back to relevance. Clint shook his head, a faint, satisfied smile on his lips. He'd walked away, not in defeat, but in triumph, leaving his enemy to choke on his own failure. The show ended in chaos. Kimmel's closing monologue rushed, his jokes falling flat, the audience's energy spent on Clint's victory. Backstage, the crew whispered about the clash, some grinning, others shaking their heads at Kimmel's arrogance. The story spread fast, from the studio to the streets, a tale of a legend who refused to bend, who faced a bully and walked away taller. Clint drove into the night, his mind already on his next project, his next story, his heart steady with the knowledge that his truth, his work, would outlast any critic's spite. The world would remember Clint Eastwood, not for Kimmel's petty fight, but for the man he was, unbroken, fearless, a giant who stood tall and never looked back.